I'm going to stand up to do this for the moment, then I'm going to sit down, where I think I'm just going to steer a couple of questions. And I'm confident with brilliance there, and whatever Begala brings to this, I'll just sit back and watch. I want to introduce briefly this panel, pretty distinguished panel. Kristen Soltis Anderson is a Republican pollster and a columnist. She's the author of the book, The Selfie Vote, where millennials are leading America and how Republicans can keep up. Time magazine listed her as 30 among the 30 under 30 changing the world. National Journal had her as one of the 25 most influential women under 35 in Washington. She is a veteran, and I asked her about this to be sure. She is a veteran of the Washington hat trick, which means she will regularly appear on Fox, CNN, and MSNBC, which not everybody gets that opportunity. Have you done that, Begala?
Oh, no, they don't let me.
They
built a wall to keep me out.
They built a wall. That's it. Keep them out. In 2010, she authored the College Republican National Committee study, Grand Old Party for a Brand New Generation, talking about ways to recruit young people to the GOP. We'll see how well that is going. And she'll, I think, help us today understand where millennials are leading us beyond what we already know, which is to selfies, BuzzFeed, and that millennial anthem, Lover Boys Working for the Weekend, which I think is it. I'm going to wait on Begala here for a second.
Uh-oh.
He's going negative, Cookie Man.
I'm going to go negative on Begala. Charlie Cook is one of the most respected political analysts in Washington. He's the editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report. He's also a columnist for National Journal. He's one of the nation's leading authorities on U.S. elections. Bob Schieffer, who we all know, once said that the Cook Report is the Bible of the political community, and it is. I certainly regularly have read and read Charlie. The Cook Political Report goes deep and does work not simply at the surface about presidential races, but Senate races, House races, gubernatorial races. In other words, he deals with facts in a way that in this campaign I wonder how important that is. He is from Louisiana, just across the border.
Now he's gone negative on me.
No. Now he is listed, if you go to the web, to the Louisiana Public TV website, he is listed among Louisiana legends. He is among we are in the presence of a Louisiana legend. On the other hand, some of the others are Jimmy Swaggart and Edwin Edwards. So that's it. Paul Begala. This will be brief. He is obviously one of the best known political consultants in Washington and in the country. He is a well-known Democrat and a political contributor on CNN. He and partner James Carville helped Bill Clinton get elected in 1992. He helped Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Frank Lautenberg in New Jersey, Zell Miller in Georgia, and others. It was more as Mark McKinnon. Mark McKinnon has a highlight reel. And on that highlight reel is the exchange of the greatest moments in sort of whatever they are, politics. One of these is Begala on Meet the Press.
I remember that. Yeah.
With Russert, Tim Russert. 14 at the height of the Clinton-Lewinsky debacle, as the loyal supporter and advocate for the president. 14 times Russert asked Begala, what about this Clinton and Lewinsky? And 14 times Begala fires back, that's not the issue. That's not the question. It's all about that campaign of lies and leaks by the Starr prosecution. What about Clinton and Lewinsky? No, lies and leaks. This went back and forth, and it was a master class in crisis communication, and for my money, you won. It was marvelous. One last thing. He is a UT graduate. I think you were a graduate. Is that right? He not only was a UT graduate, he was president of the student body when he was here. That's well known among many of you. What's less well known is he lost that election for student body president. This is a true story. He lost the election to Hank the Hallucination. Hank the Hallucination was an invisible non-entity in a cartoon character in Sam Hurt's Daily Texan comic strip. Hank the Hallucination. Some smart UT students, Dean, smart UT students mounted a write-in drive for Hank the Hallucination, and Hank the Hallucination beat Begala for the presidency of the student body, but the cartoonist solved that problem in a subsequent trip. He had a little girl, 4-year-old girl, point her finger in a subsequent comic strip at Hank the Hallucination and say, bang! And Hank the Hallucination went away, and Begala was subsequently elected the president of the student body. Absolutely true. Let's talk about some of these issues. Let me just ask each of you to talk about this, and we'll start with Kristen. And frankly, just jump in, and if I have something to ask, we will, otherwise y'all just talk. Cable TV can't get enough of Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders is disrupting the best laid plans of the Democrats, and suddenly a lot of people seem to like Ted Cruz. And so you have to ask, what is going on here? So the question really for all of you is, what is this election really about? Is this about the candidates, or is this about the country?
I think the election at the moment is about a lot of people being very frustrated with anything and everything that looks like what they've seen before. And so as a result, the definition of something like electability or what is presidential seems like it's beginning to shift a little bit in the minds of some voters. What you're seeing within the Republican Party, I think, is a sort of boiling over of a debate that has been raging in our party at least as far back as the 2008 election and perhaps even further back, which is a debate about what should the Republican Party be about, and specifically why have we been losing elections in recent years. Republicans have done quite well in these midterms, but have lost the White House and just can't seem to get together in the presidential elections. And there's a big debate right now about why that is, and you have sort of two camps that emerged. On the one hand is a camp that I would put myself in, which is that you have big, deep demographic trends that are happening in this country that are reshaping America. You have a rapidly growing Latino population, the just amazing diversity of this country increasing, particularly among the millennial generation. You have a generation that is coming of age with young people who barely remember things like September 11th. They were the kids getting picked up by mom and dad at school on that day. Their view of the world has been shaped by the fact that they don't remember life before the internet. And so you have all of these big changes that are reshaping things. And in order for Republicans to win, some of us argue, they need to understand those realities and speak to those realities. But there is another camp that says the reason why Republicans have struggled to win is because there is a lot of anxiety from sort of the white working class voter. And that as a result of not being conservative enough, which is sort of how Ted Cruz puts it, these voters have been disappointed in the GOP and have stayed home, and that in order to win them back, we need to be as conservative as possible, as pure as possible, keep our promises as much as possible, and that's what it will take to re-energize these voters and get them out to the ballot box. And there's data to suggest that both of those camps are correct in some way. What's fascinating, though, is that it's Donald Trump who's actually figured out how best to tap into that anger from the latter category, the folks that feel that they've been left behind by economic and demographic change. They see where the country's headed, and they're not sure that they're going to be a part of this bright, shiny future that an optimistic politician may have wanted to talk about in previous elections. And so because people don't feel like they're being invited to be a part of the bright, shiny future, they're frustrated, they're angry, and it's allowed folks to sort of rise up in this election who don't necessarily come across as the polished, Hollywood-style presidential candidate that you might imagine, but instead are folks that sound very different, have an agenda that might be very different than what we would expect on a presidential stage, but nonetheless people are excited for something that they think is refreshing and different. And that's why I think you've gotten to this place where you have Bernie Sanders, who continues to have Hillary Clinton on the ropes, even though math is really not in his favor on the Democratic primary side at the moment. Hillary Clinton has not been able to put him away yet, and I think it's because he speaks to a frustration that voters have that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can't get ahead anymore. And I think Donald Trump is tapping into that same sentiment, just in a very different way, with a very different style of message, and to a very different style of voters. But I do think that there's a lot more in common between the appeal of Sanders and the appeal of Trump than many times we're led to believe. We think of them as being at opposite ends of a political spectrum, but I think there's more crossover there than people expect. And so to your question about is it about the candidates or is it about the country, I think it's about the country wanting to know that are we headed in a direction where this bright future is something that all of us can participate in. And there are lots of people that feel, for one reason or another, they are not a part of the country's future.
That's a great point. I mean, I agree with all of it. If I can have one moment of personal privilege, being back home here in Austin at the university that I went to, Susan said something really important. I'm living proof. This is where my civic life was formed. It was right here on these 40 acres. You know, I grew up in Missouri City. My parents voted, but they weren't very political. And I came here, and I was awakened to a completely different world. You know, we had a nice little town, but it wasn't, you know, wasn't very exciting, it wasn't very interesting, it was very racist. And I came here, and there was all kind of different kinds of people. And I learned so much. Every single day in my public life, also, frankly, my private life, since I met my wife here, I think about and learn lessons that I learned here on campus in civic life, including life is always better when you're with people who are not just like you. There's no point in having a vigorous agreement. Okay? Kirk talked about that, and he's right. You know, you want to know, I mean, I purposefully, well, I didn't have any role in it. My wife purposefully bought a house for us in McLean, Virginia, which is the most Republican suburb of D.C., where our neighbors are like, you know, Pat Buchanan and Dick Cheney and for a while Ken Starr, that bastard. Sorry, I hold a grudge. And so you want to be around people who are not like you. That's what the university is all about, throwing different people together. Second, you cannot win if you do not play. Steve Forbert from Mississippi, a great song called that. You cannot win if you do not play. We had no student government when I came here. And so one of Greg Fenvez's predecessors, Peter Flawn, spent $7 million a year in 1982. $7 million a year of student money with no student input because there was no student government. So a bunch of us went to the legislature, went to Kirk's predecessor, Lloyd Doggett. Lloyd passed a by God bill that required Flawn. He didn't want no student input, believe me. But it required him to get student input, and then gradually we brought back student government, and that controlled that $7 million. You cannot win if you do not play. Third, government can be and must be a force for good in people's real lives. When we reconstituted student government, it was very important to me that we actually deliver on people's real lives. As Slater points out, I was defeated by a cartoon character, for goodness sakes. And his tragic, by the way, his campaign manager, Steve Patterson, so I'm so glad you fired his ass. I owed him one. So you have to deliver in people's real lives, because we were on the line. People thought it was all crap, student government. It's just a bunch of resume patterns. One of the things we did with that $7 million is we created a program 33 years ago called SURE, Students United for Rape Elimination. We wanted to protect our fellow students, especially the women, walking home at night. And from that day to this, young people, they get a little bit of training, but they put on a t-shirt, they get a little training, they got a whistle and now a cell phone, and they walk young women home after hours. And you can call that number night or day. Well, student government, at the beginning of this year, the kids running student government, Xavier Rodnowski and Rohit Mandalupo, called me up and they wanted to renew, well, it was always around, but they wanted to kind of reinvent it for the modern era. They got a Twitter handle, got an email address, got them a website. They really kind of picked it up to the next level. And so what Greg said about this loss, this homicide, is so heartbreaking. And it wasn't just in around Austin. It went worldwide because of communication. I mean, there were people crying all around the world because of what happened to this child. And our prayers do go out to her family and friends. But I am reminded of one of President Clinton's favorite proverbs. It's an African proverb. It says, when you pray, move your feet. So I will ask you, if you have, I have my nephew here who's a sophomore here, my son Billy is a sophomore here. If you have friends or kids who are students here, tell them about SURE. Tell them to either volunteer to walk girls home or, by God, use it. We have to have each other's backs. And that all came about in my life because of government, student government. And I think Kristen's right. People now are so angry because they don't see their elected officials delivering for them. This is more pronounced on the Republican side. Democrats are actually a pretty happy lot. They love President Obama, they love Hillary, they love Bernie, they love Bill Clinton. They're pretty happy people, actually. Because in the main, they believe their leaders are delivering for them. They love Nancy Pelosi. Republicans have already cooed their speaker and their majority leader. First time in American history that a House majority leader lost a primary. So, and now they've cooed every establishment figure they can find in their party. And they're even cooing people who aren't running. They're killing Paul Ryan. He's not even running for president. They're angry. And I can tell you what they say. What they say is, you've broken faith with us. And they believe they've been betrayed. And all of the exit polling, that word comes up highest on how do you feel about your party among Republicans. We feel betrayed. And it's not, I think Kristen's right when she says it's not just a right-left thing. It's not that they haven't been conservative enough. A lot of grassroots Republicans just feel like they've been lied to. And that doesn't sit well. And the fundamental thing that drives that, I believe, is stagnant income. When you only have a high school education, which nobody in this room does, but most of the guys I went to high school with at John Foster Dulles High School in Sugar Land, Texas, most of them only had a high school education. Most of us did not go to college. I got lucky. 35 years later, I'm 54, about to turn 55. You're making, as a statistical matter, 8% more than when you were an 18-year-old pimply-faced kid. 35 years of work at 8% pay raise spread over 35 years. And if you disaggregate it by race and gender, white men have done much worse. We don't say this in polite company, but there were winners under racism. They were called white men. There were winners under gender discrimination. So as they've had to compete with a more diverse and talented pool, their income's going down. Well, that will make you mad. That will piss you off. And into this, Mr. Trump says, it's the Mexicans. And he scapegoats, and he gives them an answer. And I don't think it's true, but it doesn't matter what I think. And I think it's why every time you look at the Trump vote, it is dominated by high school or less educated white men. And they're good people, and they're working really hard, but they're not getting ahead. And they have this primal need to find a reason why. And they believe they've been lied to, and they believe that immigration is behind all of it. I don't think it's true or fair or elegant, but it has been very powerful. Charlie?
Very good. Charlie.
Well, as a Louisianian, we like to say that the difference between a coon ass and a horse's ass is the Sabine River between the two states. But anyway, no, this is an amazing university. I didn't know about running a but I did know that they did run a dog, Amy the Wonder Dog, for student body president once. So very interesting university, but I guess it reflects the city. But anyway, so, you know, when I'm going through my routine, you know, it echoes a lot of what Kristen and Paul said. You know, economic anxiety, a rise of populism, and whether it's Occupy Wall Street on one side or the Tea Party movement on the other. It's about, you know, immigration. It's about culture wars. On the Republican side, there's a concern, you know, that we're facing between national security and terrorism, almost an existential threat. And what's fascinating to me is that there was an ABC Washington Post poll a month or two ago where 76% of Republicans listed national security and or terrorism as the number one and number two, or as either number one or number two issues facing the country today. But that was 20 points higher than the percentage of independents that did, and 26 points higher than the percentage of Democrats who did. So it's asymmetric. It's largely on the Republican side, but sort of you hear this apocalyptic rhetoric that's sort of another factor that's sort of adding volatility here. And then finally is what Paul was talking about, the anger, the sense of sort of betrayal among conservatives towards their own party. So there's all of that, but the one thing that didn't get brought out is that I think is another important driver, and that is the increasingly ideological nature of each party. And if you think about it, the Democratic Party today is a heck of a lot more liberal than it was 15 years ago when Bill Clinton left office. The Republican Party is a heck of a lot more conservative than it was 7 years ago when George W. Bush left office. And the political scientists tell us that we've seen ideological sorting, where conservatives are basically gone from the Democratic Party. and liberals are basically gone from the Republican Party, and each side has lost a heck of a lot of moderates. And look at it through the prism of Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. Hillary Clinton was widely seen as pretty much at the far left of her husband's administration. Now where is she? Scrambling like mad to keep up with a party that has moved way, way to her left. Jeb Bush was one of the most conservative governors in America. He got in this presidential race only to discover that he was now on the left end of the Republican Party, and he hadn't moved at all. The party had moved out from under him. And so we're seeing this incredibly, much more polarized between the two parties, and it's had an impact on governing because, the people in the middle, I mean, when I got my start while I was in college working on Capitol Hill for a conservative Democratic senator from Louisiana, Bennett Johnston. Across the hall from us on the 4th floor of the Russell Senate office building was Senator Edward Brooke, a liberal African-American Republican from Massachusetts. The Republican was a hell of a lot more liberal than the Democrat was, but you used to see that back in those days. And these were the folks that were the ballast that kind of kept their parties from going off into ditches on the left and on the right. So I think it's sort of these sort of 7 things that are creating, I mean, I sort of think of it as on the Democratic side and the Republican side, each party has this big, gigantic iron cauldrons like witches have, with toxic stuff bubbling around. And the ingredients are basically the same, just the proportions are different on the two sides. But no doubt, I mean, what we're seeing with Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, there's some common threads there, absolutely.
You all have mentioned, this witch's brew of economic uncertainty, anger. Kristen said people feel many people are left behind and so forth. Some social scientists have done some work recently, and they found an instinct, they've identified an instinct among voters. And they call it the authoritarian instinct. Now, it's not dictatorship, it's not about that. It's about a fear of others, of outsiders, a desire for order, a concern that in this country, as you've said, the economy's not doing well, their jobs are in jeopardy, or they feel they might be. Terrorists are a threat. The question I want to have is, their work was done, I think, to explain the rise of Trump. I want to ask you, Charlie, do you think that, put Trump aside, after Trump, is this instinct, fear of the other, concern about change, is that something that's in our culture and will continue to reflect itself for years and years to come on the young people who were involved in the Institute as they look for future elections? Do they need to consider that?
One of the things I think we're seeing is beyond just a general coarsening of our society and of dialogue in our country, is that we're seeing on the part of voters, increasingly voters voting against people more than for people. Yeah. And it's like they're not really crazy about their candidate, but by God, they sure as hell don't want that person or someone from that side. And that's why a friend of mine, who was Senator Rubio's pollster, was saying he thinks that we're going to have a gigantic turnout this year. Mm-hmm. And the thing about it is, it's not that young people or the far left is going to get suddenly excited about Hillary Clinton, but if you're going to have I think it's going to be Ted Cruz, not Donald Trump, but the thing about it is, these people will be out not for Hillary Clinton, but against Cruz or Trump. And over here, the only unifying, Stan Greenberg, a Democratic pollster, released a report recently, and he pointed out that there was only one thing that unified all Republicans. They all hated Hillary Clinton. You could have thrown in President Obama too, but say 2 things. But anyway, so the thing is, I think that's what's probably going to drive turnout up is the hatred that's existing in each party for people that are going to be coming up on the other side. And I find that very disconcerting. And I'll have people come up to me and say, gosh, you got to be having so much fun this year. And I sort of smile and I'll usually say, well, this is an interesting election. When it's really probably the most disturbing election it is that I've ever watched. And you know, I've got to do this a couple more years, but I just soon gone through my entire career without seeing this year come along.
The Strauss Institute is part of the College of Communications, as we know. I want to ask Paul something, and then I want to ask Christian. And that's about the role of the media in this election. The role of the media has historically been gatekeeper. The umpire calls balls and strikes. The explainer of fact, the dispassionate purveyor of what this guy says and that guy in this position and so forth. Did the media fail to properly examine Trump early? And make it brief. I know you could go on forever with that, but Trump early. And at the same time, did the media ignore Bernie earlier until he reached his I will not be ignored phase in this campaign?
Yeah, let me start with the second first. Ignoring Bernie is the best thing ever happened to him. I'm not kidding. The Native Americans were right. When someone takes your picture, you lose a piece of your soul. So you're going to have to find an electron microscope to find what I've got left of a soul by the time my career is over. Okay? Exposure is bad. It is. He was able to build a grassroots organization. He was able to dance and dance without the spotlight on him so that we didn't notice when he was tripping and falling. He got to be better by the time the spotlight was on him. The truth is, that thing, it's like you know, a magnifying glass with the sun on an ant. It will fry you. He actually benefited. He may not know that, but he has benefited from late attention because he hasn't gotten scrutiny. I commend you to do nothing else. You are all smart people. The New York Daily News sat down with Bernie and then today with Hillary Clinton. Both of these interviews were journalism at its best. Not one question. They went on for like an hour or more with each of them. Not one question about polls, not one question about strategy, not one question about gaffes. It was all about substance. And that never happens. I mean, that's a fair criticism. You know, Tom Patterson up at Harvard has written on this. He basically says this: there's one question that the media has in an election for president. That is, how are you going to win? There's one question that a voter has. What are you going to do for me if you win? How's my family, my state, my country going to be better if you win? Those are very different questions. And when we obsess about strategy, it is a disaster for the country, I think, and it feeds this cynicism. So I think Trump, actually I defend the media on this, Trump has been scrutinized, he's been publicized, it has not been hagiography, he's been asked some very, very tough questions, including by Fox News. Everybody on the left hates Fox News. They've been as tough on him as anybody. And famously, Megyn Kelly now is the brunt of his really misogynistic wrath because of it. So I think actually in terms of Trump, the press has done a good job. As a fundamental matter, though, we're back in the very same, you know, horse race kind of coverage. But if you have the time, and you do, go and read the entire transcripts. Don't let some knucklehead like me filter it. Read the entire transcripts of Trump's interview with the Washington Post editorial board, which is demented. It is. I'm sorry. You need the whole faculty, the psych department, University of Texas, to kind of decode that thing. And then read Hillary and Bernie's hour-long interviews with the Daily News. It's phenomenal. It's fantastic. And the first question they asked Bernie was this. What was the second? Was your centerpiece idea, the focal point of your campaign is breaking up the big banks. How are you going to do it? And he sounded like the old Ralph Cramden on the honeymoon. He had no idea in the world how he would do the number one thing on his agenda, because no one had ever asked him. Because all they ask him is, how are you going to win? How are you raising money? How are you doing in media? How are you running ads? And so when you actually break out of that prison of horse race journalism and ask substantive questions, you'd be surprised what you find.
Can I disagree with Paul on
Yes,
this topic?
please.
I've known Chris Matthews for 34 years. I like Chris. I would never mistake him for a journalist, but I like Chris. On every single televised debate, every single Sunday interview that Donald Trump has done, Chris was the first journalist to go after him on probing question after on the abortion about a week or so ago. And the thing about it is, you know, that they would go one question deep, two, and he'd avoid it, and they'd let him off the hook. And Chris was like a dog with a bone. You know, just wouldn't let go, and finally got Trump looking like a complete idiot, where he clearly hadn't even thought about his positions on abortion. But the thing is, no native-born journalist went after him like that. It took Chris Matthews, which I thought was really kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Let me ask Kristen this, because you said what you just said. You mentioned earlier in that positive part, talking about Sure, and the role of reinvigorating it with social media and the program on campus. About social media, not just media, but social media and its role in campaigns and in our politics, and looking ahead. Anyway, looking ahead. We know it can mobilize, but the question is it bringing us together or further pulling us apart?
It's changing the way campaigns have to think about communication, first of all. So I'm going to betray my age a little bit by saying this, but recently I've been doing my homework and reading George Stephanopoulos' book about the Clinton administration, and finished all of the stuff about the 1992 election. And there are all these stories about how you got to worry about what's the nightly news going to say, and this is your media cycle, and okay, well, you know, I'm spending my afternoon talking to reporters so that I'm defining what the news is saying that night. Donald Trump doesn't care about the nightly news. Donald Trump wants to change the news. He fires off a tweet. A bad story's happening and he wants it to go away. He tweets something outrageous, and all of a sudden everybody drops what they were doing and the new shiny object becomes the thing of the moment. You mentioned Mark McKinnon is here. The Circus, the series that they do on Showtime, has this really great scene that shows the Clinton campaign sort of in the immediate aftermath of the Brussels attacks, where as soon as the attacks happen, you've got Donald Trump calling in to every news show in America that will take a phone interview with him, talking about, if I was president, this sort of thing would never happen. I'm going to keep America safe. And the Clinton campaign, perhaps thoughtfully, is saying we're going to sit back, we're going to think about what our statement says. They're not calling every news station that will pick up. And so you may look at what Donald Trump does and say, well, this is crazy, right? Shouldn't you sit back? Shouldn't you wait for the facts to come in? Shouldn't you decide what your response would be? Maybe say some prayers for the folks who have been affected. But no, he has figured out that there is this appetite for just constant consumption of content, whatever it is. And whether that's good or bad, I think, remains to be seen. I think there's a lot of bad to it, because I think it prevents us from getting to those deep questions of how is this affecting my life? It prevents us from getting 3 or 4 questions deep on something. It lets us say, well, I'm going to make America great again, and you move on to the next thing. On the other hand, I do think there is some value in the idea that somebody who is running for president is directly communicating with voters. Mm-hmm. Now, it may not look like what we think of as presidential. It may not look like what we think of as the way somebody should be behaving if they want to be the commander-in-chief. But I do think that there is something positive out there about the fact that via social media, the behind-the-scenes look at who a candidate is, that a little bit more of that kind of unvarnished view of who they are, if used effectively, can shine through. So I think there are a lot of downsides. I think the way we've seen it play out in this election has been pretty bad. But I especially think if you want to talk about the next generation and reaching them in this election, I'm with Charlie, by the way. A lot of folks ask me, well, aren't all these young voters going to stay home? They're going to see Hillary Clinton, who's getting beat by a 4-to-1 margin among young voters in the Democratic primary. Donald Trump's unfavorables are horrible with young voters. Ted Cruz's unfavorables are horrible with young voters. Aren't they all going to stay home? And I think you're right. I think they're going to get scared into saying, one of these Republicans is going to take away the rights from your gay best friends or your gay cousin or from you. They want to send your Latino friend or you out of this country. They don't want you to participate in this society. They want to take us backwards. And I think that message is very terrifying to a lot of people, and I suspect you will see a lot of young voters turning out. And so I am not optimistic. You mentioned the name of my book is Where Millennials Are Leading America and How Republicans Can Keep Up. I'm not confident that that's happening right now. And I think that social media is going to be a big part of how young people are getting their information to decide if they want to engage in this process this year. I think a lot of what they're going to see is very negative, but also very motivational.
Let me follow up just real quickly, and there's some evidence that millennials especially are less loyal to political parties, at least in the United States.
Absolutely.
What's more important? What has more influence right now? Political parties or these social networks?
In the contrast between political parties and anything, I will choose anything, has more power than political parties right now.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if you want to focus on millennials, the idea of wearing any kind of label seems really constraining. Does being a Republican mean I have to agree with everything the Republican Party stands for? Does being a Democrat mean I have to agree with everything the Democratic Party stands for? So you see a majority of millennials now just identifying as independents because the value and identity of being with a political party does not matter as much as, say, being on campus and joining the Campus Action for Climate group or the Campus LGBT Rights group or something like that.
One more quick thing about that, because you're the expert in this area. Is it the less solid loyalty of millennials for the political parties, is that a function of millennials who just generally are less interested in organization or institutions? That's a better way of saying it. The institutions, or is it that millennials are less engaged with this institution, our political parties, which have failed us?
I think it's a lot of institutions. I think it's acute with the political parties. But you do see, for instance, in religion, you'll see young voters are just as likely to say that they are spiritual, they're just as likely to say that they pray daily and that they are people of faith, but they are significantly less likely to go to church on Sunday or to identify with a particular religious tradition by name. So that's just one example of where, in some ways, their behaviors are not so different from perhaps their parents or grandparents, but the way that they label themselves or the way they relate to an existing, long-standing institution is very different.
I mean, the thing is, I'm sitting here hearing about, okay, parties are breaking. We're seeing more straight party voting in America right now than we've ever seen in certainly our lifetimes. And this business about millennials not being loyal to parties, I can hear them saying that, right. But when was the last time a Republican got elected with a lot of millennial support?
Ronald Reagan in 1984, he won by 19
points. Well, those weren't millennials, they weren't born then. But the thing about it is if they're voting one way. So I don't, I think we're seeing between gerrymandering, between, an increasingly ideologically driven media, and whether it's Fox on one side or MSNBC and various websites on the other. No, I see the battle lines hardening. I don't, there's almost no middle there.
Well, I'll agree with you that young voters are not in love with the Republican Party and are voting very Democratic and have been in a way that is ahistorical. But I would disagree that they are in love with the Democratic Party.
Oh, I didn't say they're in love, but the thing is, it only matters how they vote. Whether they say they love the Democratic Party is absolutely irrelevant if they're voting down the line Democratic when they vote.
I do think it makes it easier if Republicans wanted to seize the opportunity to try to win them back. It's hard to get someone to take that party jersey off and put a new jersey on. If somebody starts off as independent, I think that does make it a little bit easier if you had the right candidate and you had the right message and you had a little magic fairy dust, which Republicans seem to be lacking these days. I do think that makes it that this generation does not have to be a lost one for Republicans. It is shaping up that way.
It's over.
After this election, I think you may be right, but I think we had a chance this year.
Meaningless to millennials.
Well, they're not independent, but they're anti-Republican because they're liberal. They don't love the Democratic Party. They do distrust institutions. Christian, you're exactly right. I don't know what the Republicans can't use fairy dust. They're against gay rights. Part of what's killing them with young people. Okay, we've had two, as we say here, 2 8-year presidencies back to back. And in the first, when George W. Bush was running against Al Gore, Gore won the youth vote by 1 point. 1 point. By the end of that presidency, well, first of all, in the middle of it, John Kerry won the youth vote by 14. So something's happening. Young people are identifying negatively against Bush. The only other time it's happened in my lifetime was Nixon, who created a whole generation of Democrats. By the second term, the end of the second term for Bush, Obama wins the youth vote by 37. So you've gone from winning by 1 to winning by 37. Now, the end of Obama, young people love him. So it's a combination that just, when I was a student here, Reagan came here, had the biggest damn rally you ever saw in your life. He won, as Kristen points out, he won young people by 18 points. Guess what? My reunions, they're 55-year-old white guys I went to college with, they're still Reagan Republicans. They didn't change. These kids aren't going to change. So it's a combination of negative identification with Bush, who young people somehow figured out that like he lied about a war and he ran a gay bashing re-election campaign, which doesn't sit very well with young people, and now Obama, who they love. And I honestly don't know what they have to do is what was in the GOP autopsy, which is modernize, moderate, stop hating on gays, stop hating on immigrants, and they're taking the best self-examination I've ever seen a political party do, and they're throwing it right out the window. It's amazing to me. But I don't think they get back with young people.
The problem is the polarization runs both ways. So in that same 2000 election where you have Al Gore barely winning young voters, he also barely won senior citizens. It's hard to imagine nowadays, if you look at the exit polls and how senior citizens vote, they break so heavily Republican. And so the generational polarization is broken both ways, and Republicans in these midterm elections have been doing fairly well. And so that has, I think, led some Republicans to say, well, that autopsy was nice, but look, we picked up the Senate.
Well, but the senior citizens changed completely. I mean, senior citizens used to be one of the most democratic voting blocs there was. Of course, there was a picture of Franklin Roosevelt in their homes, but they're gone. And Ronald Reagan is more of a guiding light to people 65 and older now than FDR was. So it's not that seniors switched, it's just the pool of seniors are completely different than they were before, and now it's the strongest voting Republican group.
It's cohort replacement. You know, Kinky Friedman said they ain't making Jews like Jesus anymore. They ain't making seniors like my grandma anymore. If you were 45 when you voted for Reagan, you're 75 now.
See, it was worth the price of admission to get...
the great political philosopher, Kinky Friedman.
Whatever. I don't want us to get away, because we only have a few minutes here, without really talking a moment about, gosh, we're all divided. Young, old, thing, all of which is true. All of which is absolutely true, and we're watching it express. You're a loser, you're a liar. Okay. Fine, we all know that. The Annette Strauss Institute, and certainly Annette Strauss herself, reflected ideas of leadership which are about engagement, public engagement, voting, being informed, and working with your community in a way that works with your community. Those were the values: tolerance, inclusion, community good. Is there anything on the horizon, not at the moment about Donald Trump or Hillary or whatever, but is there anything that as you look now into the future that you see in a positive way, something on the landscape that could foster these kind of virtues and these kind of values?
No.
Well, I mean, you may be right. You may be right.
Yes.
Go ahead. Well, wait a minute, hold on. Charlie, why do you say that?
Well,
and why do you say yes?
Yes.
You know, when I talk to normal people, not that there are any normal people in this room, but say, you know, for God's sake, vote for people who share your values, who share your philosophy. Do that, but don't vote for anyone just like that will not sit down with someone they disagree with, someone wearing a different colored jersey, and just at least try to find some common ground and hash things out. But that's not where we're going right now. And my fear is that it is going to take a crisis, another horrible crisis, to kind of be the electroshock therapy to kind of juice both voters and elected officials. Because, you know, if you think about it, during the 2000 Bush-Gore race, up until Election Day, that was the most civil presidential election we had had in a long time. George W. Bush was running as a compassionate conservative. Al Gore was running as a really boring technocrat. and it wasn't until Election Day in Florida where one half of America was going to believe that the election was stolen and we had an illegitimate president. And the only question was which half was it going to be? And all of a sudden, that changed everything. 9/11 occurs, members of Congress gather on the Capitol steps the next day. They sing God Bless America. I thought briefly that maybe something good was going to come out of this horrific tragedy. And then what happens very soon after? The fight. Should we invade Iraq? Yes or no? And I don't blame either side, but boom. And we haven't been back since. So if 9/11 was unable to do that, what in the heck will it take? And then we'd have to just pray that nothing happens right after that that will pull it back apart again.
Well, first, the Annette Strauss Institute helps, and lots of other ways that we try to bring people together. I'm a huge proponent of national service. I'm part of a group with General Stanley McChrystal, who's our top general in Afghanistan. He came home and he thought the best thing he could do for his country was to do what the military did, take lots of different kinds of people, put them together in common service, and set them out to work. It started with the points of light. By the way, when President Bush Sr. was leaving office, the one thing he asked of Bill Clinton was to save points of light. Not only did Clinton save it, he expanded into AmeriCorps and put hundreds of thousands of young people in it. He, in turn, then asked Bush's son to make sure to preserve AmeriCorps, which Bush did, to his eternal credit. Those kinds of things, blessed be the ties that bind, is the old Baptist hymn. Here's why they're afraid. It's evolutionary biology. When we get scared, we shut off our thinking brain, and we go with the amygdala. If you're fearful or angry, you stop thinking. So we have to find ways to abate that fear, and politicians right now are feeding that fear. But if you have worked with people who are not like you, we are more divided than we've ever been. Charlie's exactly right. But we can find ways to rebuild those. This institute is a big part of that. I think national service should be mandatory, but it will never get there. But it certainly ought to be a way to work off your student debt or get some kind of minimal stipend. It should be much more broad because we don't have enough ways that we throw people together who are fundamentally different. And so we easily become fearful, which made sense, 100,000 years ago. If somebody who looked different from you came into your camp, it's a pretty good idea to kill him. Right? He was the other. You were scared, so you lashed out. And we have to find ways to appeal to what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. And this institute does that.
And I hate to say it, it's time to wrap this up. Is that okay, Kristen?
That's fine.
Okay. And on the note that I think I heard Little Miss Sunshine, a positive note from Bagala, who can be the force of darkness, or the children of darkness. I think the most endearing thing that he said, and we have to think about it, is do organizations like the Annette Strauss Institute, do they contribute to an opportunity where we can work together as opposed to what Charlie says is so true, this extraordinary polarization.
Let the record show I want to be wrong.
Okay, very good. This is a most wonderful panel, and thank you very much, panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a great job. I agree with everything.